Hey folks, thanks for being a part of our devotions today. We're going to continue with our character study of David. If you missed part one, this is part two. You may want to look at that first before you jump into this one. But I'll give you a quick review if you're just starting with part two. We talked about David and how he came from a typical Jewish family. What was not very typical was he was early on anointed to be king. And not all of us can walk through that as something typical, but he was the youngest of 8 sons of Jesse. And it seemed to be that his character quality which stood out the most was that he was a man after God's own heart. God was not interested in stature or how tall you were or how good looking you were, his appearance. And the people were certainly taken by their last choice, King Saul, right before him. David was a different character altogether. So this would serve David well that he followed God with his heart, as he was a man noted for how he approached things. He would ask God for help. In fact, it was something that served him well, as Saul appointed him to help calm his nerves. And when the evil spirit would come to Saul, David would play the harp and calm him down. Another time as a youth, it seems to be he was 16 or 17 that he fought the great Goliath and took him out when no one else would. So super brave, had prominent men around him that honored him and loved him, and he was a brave warrior in the early part of his life. And eventually Saul would die. David would take the throne in part. He would be a part of the southern kingdom of Judah. Saul, his son, took over for a couple years, and then there was unrest in his kingship after him. Eventually, David was anointed for the second time, again around Judah, being the leader and king over Judah. And then eventually he would unite north and south as unified Israel, and he's anointed the third time as the king of all of Israel. You know, you'd think at this point, as rest took place and he had defeated his enemies and now they are united, he was comfortable and he was going to enter his rest. No. And folks, it reminds me, sometimes I know when I have peace or rest, this is when the enemy starts working on me, maybe bringing up a sin of the past or guilt or shame that I felt, and he wants to use that against me and help me maybe wreck my relationship with others or with my God. So folks, be careful in times of rest and comfort. Everything's good. The enemy is crouching at your door. So be careful. How do we know this? Well, in David's life, this happened. It seems like if you open up the book of 2 Samuel and you look at chapter 11 in particular, it starts off like this kind of flowery novel, and that, you know, it's springtime and it's almost a picture of walking through the meadows and your hands are running through the flowers. And it says it's the time when we go off to war and the kings are having their good time. It's at this point when David is relaxing in the palace, and he goes up top and he looks over in the palace up on the rooftop, and he sees this woman and she's bathing. And it's right at this point perhaps that he is thinking about this woman and perhaps lusting. And it's at this point, maybe he has not sinned as of yet. You know, James, the book of James, reminds us of how sin is conceived. It begins as this kind of this dragging away, and you're enticed. And yet at that point, there's not a sin that's committed. Perhaps you're moving towards this, almost as if Paul wraps it up in 1 Corinthians 10 as he says, when you are tempted, God's going to provide a way out. Right? We know that. And at this point, could David had a way out? I believe so. But yet we find out that he's dragged away and enticed, and that sin gives birth. And the end of that birth is actually death. It's interesting. Sin takes its full course. Complete taken away from a relationship with God. It's interesting. So David completes his sin, if you will, with Bathsheba, as we know. They have a child together. And in fact, the Bible says that when David found out about this, he premeditated a way to kill her husband. And so he did that. He told the commander, put this guy Uriah, Bathsheba's husband, in the front lines, and I'm going to pull the army back so he will be sure to get killed. An amazing, awful sin. You know, to me, if I was the judge, I would say, David, I don't think you could be forgiven for this. And the Bible says that David knew his sin after being confronted by the prophet. And he said, God, forgive me. And God forgave him. Folks, again, if I was a judge, I don't like that. And I'm so glad that God does not hold my sin against me. Those times that I succumbed to this sin and I gave birth to it. And the God could have killed me and separated me, but he chose not to. Folks, that's where I want to live. This fact that even in our mistakes and our gross sin, God does not reject us. That is our big takeaway from David and his life. David's consequences, though, would be great, as this child would die and violence would be a part of his family for a long, long time. His sons would try to usurp the throne as he was on it, and many others of his sons would be tragically killed. But David would be the picture of someone who had mistakes yet rose above because God was with him and he was a man after God's own heart. That's what we could take away from today, folks. I appreciate you watching, and we'll see you again next time.